Hello, and welcome to this session and our presentation, Sound Perspectives for COVID-19 Tourism Recovery that Reconnects People and Nature. Together with my co-authors, Andrea, Ednie, Karen Beeftink, and Andrés, Adiego, we want to thank you for taking the time to hear our presentation and think about it and add your thoughts and help us to improve our research and learn together. So what's this presentation about? Well, the reemergence of travel after COVID-19 represents a unique opportunity for natural protected areas and nature-based tourism destinations. If protected areas can facilitate positive, direct, personal experiences that touch off on all of the senses, and especially in natural settings closer to home, they may help reverse the cycle of disconnection and apathy that has resulted from greater urbanization and increasing disconnections between people and nature. So this study draws on the context that what people bring into one context, they also bring into others. And we hope to expand understanding of natural protected area soundscape experiences by exploring the acoustic environments experienced by national tourists in Chile when they're at home and at work, and that this information and our study will provide valuable insight for protected area managers in post-COVID tourism development. So this study combines data collected in an in-person intercept visitor survey within the Coyhaique National Reserve and a follow-up online survey conducted with a subsample of the same participants. The Coyhaique National Reserve is located about 1,600 kilometers south of Santiago, which is the capital of Chile, and it's located in the Aysén region, about 5 kilometers from the regional capital of Coyhaique. But keep in mind that the entire region of Aysén has a population of 100,000 people, although it's about the size of the state of Mississippi. So the regional capital holds about 50,000 of the total in the region. And overall, as being part of Patagonia, it's a pretty remote and low population density place. The 6,531 acre reserve encompasses the eastern summit of the Sinchao Mountain, which is within the transitional range in between the Patagonian fjords and the eastern steppe. While the national conditions of the reserve are far from pristine and some sectors are dominated by non-native reforestation stands, visitors can also experience expansive expanses of natures and mature second growth native forest, lagoons, lakes, and area above the tree line with scree along the summit, putting them in direct contact with a lot of the emblematic natural aspects of Chilean Patagonia and its varied ecosystems. The Coyhaique National Reserve has been experiencing high visitation growth over the last decade, as access and affordability to visit the region of Aysén in Patagonia has improved. So when we conducted our field research during the peak tourism summer months, January to March 2019, we were able to obtain a sample with a lot of visitors coming from Santiago and other major urban areas within the country. And that allowed us to really have some good insights on national tourists, especially now that is going to be such a key market coming out of COVID-19 for the first couple of years. Chile is one of the most urban countries in South America. It's one of only 28 countries or areas of the world where 40% or more of the urban population are situated in a single city, and that's Santiago. The effects of Chile's urbanization over the past several decades really extend to many different levels. Increasing urban density within Chile's traditional urban spaces has been accompanied by significant urban sprawl throughout much of the country. And all of that has contributed to significant air, noise, water pollution problems, other environmental concerns, landscape fragmentation, loss of natural habitats, biodiversity threats. As well, several social problems have been attributed to higher population density and urban growth, like congestion, segregation, higher stress, sedentary lifestyles, obesity, related health concerns. And now, with conditions of drought being very prevalent within the center part of the country, where Santiago and many of the urban centers are located, there's also problems with food supply and water supply. Green spaces within cities are considered as critical space in urban conditions, but they're in short supply in Chile. And so numerous studies relate health concerns in Chile to urbanization. So, with all of that as important context that kind of sets up where we're working, who the people are that we're working with, this research sought a more integral understanding of Chilean national travelers, especially those who will travel to visit their country's natural protected areas from highly urban centers, with the objective of helping to prepare destinations and PA managers to better reconnect visitors with nature through sounds in the aftermath of the pandemic. To inform managers and destinations, this study reaches beyond soundscape perceptions visitors reported within the Coyhaique National Reserve to examine how these same people experience sounds and noise in the other context of their daily lives, including home and work. In our research questions, there were 3. The first, how do the sounds participants perceive at home, work, and in the CNR come together into a common framework? The second looked at how do the sound categories and themes that people perceive differ within the home, CNR, and work context. And the third was how do particular sounds manifest differently between those same 3 contexts. So data collection for this study took place in 2 phases. The first phase were the CNR in-person surveys, which took place over the summer months of 2019 with visitors over the age of 18 within intercepts that took place in 8 sampling points throughout the reserve that represented a variety of different ecosystems and soundscapes. And we intercepted a total of 1,108 visitors. 899 completed the survey, which we were really happy about. That gave us an 81.1% response rate. And then of that group, we asked them if they would be willing to participate in a follow-up web-based survey, and 810 participants volunteered their contact information for that web-based survey. So phase 2 was the follow-up web-based survey, which was initiated in May, a few months after their visit. And we used email message to initiate, followed by up to 5 reminders, stacked 3 to 5 days apart, using the guidance of Dillman et al., 2014. The contact emails that we sent contained a unique link, which was associated with each participant. So we were able to match the ID links from phase 1 and phase 2, and then tie the data together. The link led them to a Qualtrics survey, which was developed in both Spanish and English, so that depending on their native language, they could choose which one they would see, and required them to provide informed consent. Of the 810 participants that volunteered to participate in the follow-up survey, 389 responses were collected, which represented almost a 50% response rate after 30 unusable email addresses were removed. In terms of survey questions and data analysis, for phase 1, we used basic visit and demographic information and visitor observations of the sounds they heard during a listening activity. For the listening activity, participants were asked to be still and relax for 2 minutes while they focused on listening. The surveyors timed the 2 minutes of listening, and then the participants listed all of the sounds that they heard. For phase 2, The follow-up web-based survey, we used demographic information and details about the participants' home and work environments, complementing the demographic information that we had obtained in phase 1. And then we asked them about prominent sounds they heard at home and work. The prominent sounds were collected in an open-ended format where participants were asked to list the 3 most prominent sounds within each context, home and work. So who were our participants? Well, Table 1 describes the study sample, which held relatively equal gender representation, slightly more females than males. The majority of participants, almost 75%, were between the ages of 18 and 35, and only less than 5% were in the older bracket of 56 or more years of age. More than half of the participants lived in large urban areas like Gran Valparaiso, Gran Concepcion, or the metropolis of Santiago, and almost 70% of them lived within single-family homes. And again, almost 70% of them worked in office settings. Since this study was exploratory, we used qualitative coding methods. So rather than using standardized classifications, our methods facilitated the construction of meaning and still allowed us to ground ourselves in PA literature and applications through the incorporation of established thematic categories like geophony, beophony, anthrophony that are commonly used in PA soundscape research. So open coding methods were used to analyze the open-ended survey responses regarding the most prevalent sounds participants observed in each of their different environments, CNR, home, and work. First, the research team collaboratively compiled and thematically sorted the open-ended responses into a dictionary of codes and their meanings. Then, axial coding and constant comparison methods were employed to refine and align similar open codes between the 3 acoustic contexts and organize the codes around the 9 axial categories: wind, water, forest, birds, insects, animals, vehicles, human sounds, and technology and appliances. So for example, in the CNR, the open and coded sounds of people walking along trails were identified as being similar to the sounds of people walking across floors within homes or offices. So both of these codes were assigned to the people walking code within the human sounds axial category. Finally, the thematic coding captured the complexity of sounds perceived by participants within the themes of geophony, beophony, anthrophony to be consistent with existing acoustic research. So this figure depicts a lot in terms of our results. It shows the perceived sounds for the 3 contexts, and they're organized around the 9 axial categories under the 3 overarching themes: geophony, beophony, anthrophony. And the sizes of the bubbles demonstrate the amount of perceived sounds within each context and each axial theme. So for the CNR context, geophonic sounds predominated the acoustic experience. As you can see, most of those, 74% of those almost, were related to wind. Biophonic sounds were much less prevalent within the CNR acoustic experience. Only about 26% of participants perceived biophonic sounds. And anthrophonic sounds were lower still. Only about 8% of participants perceived those sounds. Then if you go on across or go on down to the next row, results for the home and work context contrasted sharply with those of the CNR. Participants reported far fewer geophonic sounds, only 13% and 6.5% respectively, and a predominance of anthrophonic sounds, 58% and 86% respectively. Slightly more biophonic sounds were heard at home than in the CNR, but within the work context, biophony-related sounds were very few, only about 7%. So when we look at anthrophony, although infrequent, CNR anthrophonic sounds were typically associated with humans in terms of the axial category, And that means that they were related to people's voices or people walking through the reserve or people using an axe or some sort of sound such as that. And to a much lesser degree, almost non-existent, there were some sounds perceived within vehicles in industry in terms of the axial category. In contrast, all three axial categories of anthrophony dominated the home and work context. At home, anthrophonic vehicles and industry sounds dominated participants' perceptions as the predominant axial category within the acoustic context of home. They comprised 31% of all of the sounds that are heard at home. So 1 in 3 sounds that people perceived were related to vehicles and industry. And 54% of the sounds within the anthrophony category. The human sounds axial category predominated the work acoustic environment. So they were about 35%, 36% of the total work sounds, and 41% of all of the anthrophony in the work setting. Technology and appliances, which were absent in the CNR, were fairly present at work, about 28% of the total work sounds, and somewhat prevalent at home, about 10% of those homes. So from this chart, you can really get a feel for just how different the settings were in terms of the context and how different the experience would be to be listening within the natural setting of the CNR as compared to what people hear when they're at home and at work. So these differences within themes and axial category perceptions that participants had across the acoustic context motivated us to do some further analysis of the open code sound perceptions associated with the biophony theme and the human theme and the wind sound theme amongst the axial categories. This slide shows you a little bit about was going on across the different contexts in terms of biophony related sounds. In the first yellow block, you can see the prevalence of these sounds as they were reported in each of the 3 contexts. And then you can see in the color blocks the dominance or lack of dominance of certain sounds. And then across the pictures, we've tried to show you some of the sounds that were reflected, but these are not necessarily represented in terms of dominance. Yeah, so within the biophony theme, wild birds and bird songs were the most prevalent sound code perceived for both the CNR and the work context. It was the second highest at home, surpassed only by dogs and dogs barking, which was not reported at all in the CNR, but was the second most prevalent sound heard in biophony within the work environment. All of the other biophony sound codes in the home and work environments were related to domestic animals. There was a greater biophonic sound variety reported for the CNR than the other 2 contexts, both overall and in terms of non-domestic sources. Sound codes heard in the CNR that were not reported in the home and work environments included insects, horseflies, mosquitoes, flies, cicadas, grasshoppers, crickets, and frogs and toads. None of these sounds were reported as being prevalent within the context of home or work for our participants. So this slide is organized in the same way, and this time what we're looking at is the human-related sounds axial category, and in the same fashion, in the yellow squares, you can get an idea of the amount of prevalence of these types of sounds that were reported in each of the 3 contexts by the participants. And then in the color block squares, you can get an idea of the prevalence and diversity of sounds within this human-related sounds axial category. So a couple of trends. Human-related sounds in the CNR included adults and people walking roughly at the same amount, followed by people generic, and then to a much lesser degree, children and personal sounds. The remaining sounds, which were just under 4%, were generated by people interacting with or utilizing other materials, like hand tools. The sounds of children were perceived with similar frequency across all of the three contexts. In the CNR, they were about 12.5%. At home, they were slightly under 12%. And at work, they were 13.4%. Yet, both home and work had much larger percentages of adult sounds. Home had 45% of adult sounds, and work had 53%, as opposed to the CNR, which was slightly under 27%. Personal sounds were less prevalent in home. Personal sounds are things like when you're breathing, or if you're hearing your hair blowing or something like that. Those were much less prevalent at home and at work than they were in the CNR. And then there was a greater variety of human sounds at home and work versus the CNR. Additional sounds that did not manifest in the CNR included people moving objects, food and kitchen sounds, the sound of rustling boxes, and also bicycles. A final axial category breakdown that we were interested in was the sound of wind, because we've always believed that wind could be a deterrent to tourists in Patagonia, where it is so prevalent. And we wanted to really key in and understand how wind is perceived by participants in the study. So for the wind axial code, the most striking contextual difference involved the extent of detail that participants used to describe wind in the CNR as compared to at home and work. And you can see this clearly in the diagram. All home and work context perceived wind sounds were captured within 2 or 3 total codes, almost 93% of them. And the overwhelming majority of total wind sounds were described generically. In contrast, in the CNR, wind descriptions spanned 8 total codes. Additional specificity detailed the way that wind interacted with objects, trees, branches, leaves, foliage, rocks, water, or with participants' own bodies or clothing. So in terms of the discussion, we want to share with you several surprises that we found in terms of the results at home and work. While we expected most of the sounds related to human interactions to occur in the home setting, we were really surprised to learn that our participants perceived these sounds with greater frequency within the work context. That's where they really picked up on perceptions of conversations, laughter, the sounds of children. And we think this is really interesting, considering that there's been such a shift in terms of people spending time at work or spending time at home, and what those differences might have meant. We were also really surprised to see that vehicles and industry sounds were the most commonly perceived category within the work context. They were noticed there more often than in any other context. And we found that not only surprising, but interesting to reflect upon, again, considering the amount of time participants are spending at home now, and changes in traffic patterns as a result of COVID. In stark contrast to the soundscapes described in daily urban settings, the CNR acoustic environment was almost exclusively perceived through natural sound sources. 92.2% of the perceived sounds heard in the CNR were related to geophony or beophony. When anthropophonic sounds were heard, they were almost exclusively associated with quieter types of human sounds like footsteps, conversations, and the sounds associated with one's own breath. That was very encouraging for us because we had been worried about the amount of increasing anthropogenic noise that could be perceived within the reserve, considering how close it is to Coyhaique, how quickly Coyhaique is growing as a city, and increased vehicular traffic. But based on the results of this study, one can easily imagine how a vacation experience that includes immersion in this natural environment provides moments of escape from the frenetic noise that participants hear every day in their urban settings. Contrast in the degrees and forms of anthropogenic noise within the different life context accentuated the need to conserve and protect natural soundscapes. For example, it was very concerning to us that in the home context, the prevalent type of sounds associated with beophony were actually dogs and dogs barking. We had expected it to be birds. That tends to be the case in most of the literature. So to see those kinds of results just drove home for us the need to protect the natural soundscapes within a reserve setting and make sure that people are not exposed to those types of noises when they're in a protected area. And then thirdly, it was very interesting to us how in the Coyhaique National Reserve, people seem to be able to reconnect themselves with nature and hear the details in nature. Comparison of the ways in which the themes and axial codes manifested within each of the acoustic contexts suggested that participants could recognize and describe a finer level of detail with respect to the natural sounds in the Coyhaique National Reserve as compared with the sounds at home and work. For example, while they were in the CNR, participants described not only wind, but how it sounded as it moved through trees, grass, water, and landscape. The same occurred with respect to insects. Visitors described insects at the species level more frequently than general mentions of insects. In contrast, within their home and work context, participants tended to simply mention wind in a generic way and didn't observe any insects at all. And so that suggests to us that, in fact, these immersive sensory kind of experiences in protected areas may be able to help contribute to rebuilding connections between people and nature. And so, of course, more research is needed, but we found these to be very promising results. So what are some of the implications of this study? Well, our research has helped us to better understand urban visitors to protected areas and what their lives are like when they're outside of the protected area. As tourism begins to reestablish in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, PAs will have a unique window of opportunity to attract local and national tourists that are looking for vacation options closer to home and help them to build stronger connections with nature. The popular press and a growing amount of research suggest that COVID-19 restrictions may have facilitated a shift with more people appreciating time in nature and developing new habits, allowing them to experience the health benefits time in nature provides. So, PAs should identify ways to maintain these new habits, even after society recovers from the pandemic, by fostering lasting connections with nature. Providing national visitors with immersive natural soundscape sensory experiences like special quiet trails or sound walks may help to facilitate those kinds of connections. So I'll close with a few final thoughts. Our study identified a number of relevant and important results about visitors' perceptions of the protected area, home, and work sound environments that can inform further efforts to guide PA managers and destinations in the evolution of tourism in the wake of COVID-19. Understanding the perspectives and perceptions of local and national visitors is extremely important to this effort, especially in light of immediate needs and travel patterns as tourism begins to reemerge. Protected areas offer unique, close-to-home opportunities to travel and explore the nature of one's own country in socially distanced settings. A protected area focus on strengthening the potential for human-nature connections through immersive, sensory-based, human-nature interactions offers promise. And it also offers opportunities to bridge human and environmental health with economic recovery for the many communities in surrounding areas. As tourism begins to resume in the wake of the COVID pandemic, the prevalence of wild birds and their songs, as well as a variety of insects and their respective sounds, could become the focus for interpretive programs and sound walks designed to expose and inform visitors about sounds they don't regularly hear. Connecting these sounds to the health of the natural environment might help build awareness of good environmental practices and behaviors that could contribute to pro-environmental behaviors, a reversal in extinction of experience cycles, and a move towards a COVID-19 tourism recovery that reconnects people and nature. Thanks so much for listening to our presentation, and I really hope we can dialogue and generate some good conversation. Take care. Be well.